So welcome back to Geography 106, Human Geography. We're going to talk about some concepts that kind of lay the framework for the entire class, and then we'll get into our various sectors we talked about in terms of transportation, religion, language, ethnicities. I typically call those the three pillars in human geography, starting with ethnicity and language and religion. It's kind of used to teaching that aspect of it. We talk about many other things such as agriculture, transportation, and development. Development meaning industrialization, also emerging. It's been called different things over the years, but that's essentially where we're going to go. So we're going to talk about human geography and the cultural aspects now. Okay, so study relationships between people and places in which they live. That's kind of our cultural approach to human geography, kind of a way of life of a common group. We have different ways of life that can exist. For instance, here's an example of Buddhist temple in Laos and then Catholic Church in Honduras. We can see both culturally different religions practice and also different architecture practice through the buildings. So it's not static, it's a process usually tied to local people. Some related to physical environment in terms of what we call diversity. We see that word quite a bit, and we can also apply that to cultural diversity. Really applying to space and models, kind of distribution through space. We do see the concept of the CBD in North America. Here we have samples where there's actual spine going to the CBD, which is a little bit different through Latin America. In Latin America, we frequently see like satellite or smaller cities close to larger cities. We don't see that so much in the United States. Idea of place connotes subjective, idiographic, humanistic type of geography brought together closer. Power and ideology, groups with less power may participate in alternative cultures. So we see power having influence both positive and negative. And then we have this idea, we mentioned space before as far as regions. So formal, functional, and vernacular. Formal, inhabited by people having one cultural trait in common. Functional, more of a common type of practice together, and the vernacular is more along lines of communication. So border zones rather than lines. Core periphery. Here we go back talking about functional, having nodes or central points where it's coordinated and directed. Vernacular, practiced by its inhabitants, a collective spatial perception, as I mentioned before, communication. Okay, so now we're going to jump into mobility a little bit. I talked about this in the opening introduction. Mobility fitting into IoT and distribution and all that with the internet and internet connections we had in the map and the opening introductions where we met. So mobility, ability to reach people, ideas, or things. Obviously, we see that a lot more with the internet and wireless communication. Then we see diffusion, which is a distribution. Here are some samples of diffusion patterns. Sometimes it's nearest neighbor, closest spreading to immediate. Sometimes it's kind of following more of a network or a path. Here's an example of diffusion we saw with influenza with the H1N1 pandemic. So some of you may have heard that called the bird flu, because that's how it was transmitted. And time distance decay, this is basically what are the resistance. So along the lines of what we were talking about here, cultural diffusion, we have different types of things that actually resist it, absorbing barriers or permeable barriers. And along the lines of that, we have migrations. We have stepwise migration, like going through stages, international migration, going through different countries, return, seasonal, transnational. Example of immigrants in Europe. We have the whole idea of globalism. In my Geo105 class, we essentially pick a paper topic. We talk about the whole concept of globalism, which can mean a lot of things, but ultimately means spreading or influence between regions, whether vernacular or functional, so forth, like we talked about before. So it really starts with linking and interdependence, and we can have uneven development from that. And we have many different things we can measure in the world. So we'll talk about basically the UN and all the different influences where humanitarian efforts happen. And one of the key measures of that was developed was the Human Development Index, the HDI, which essentially what we're seeing right here. That tells you basically what is the quality of life, which is usually measured by country. So that helps the UN as far as humanitarian efforts. Cultural ecology, nature, culture. What is the reference or relationship between those? We talked about interrelationships before. The idea of possibilism, which essentially humans influencing, let's get back to that, humans causing influence to the environment as opposed to environmental determinism. We have environmental perception, so what exactly is happening with the environment, natural hazards, influence of danger to a habitat. We have more natural hazards in the United States than anywhere in the world. I don't know if you guys knew that. Interesting factoid. Organic view of nature from the ground up, from life, mechanistic view. Humans are separate, hold dominion over nature. A lot of influence. And this is our idea of ecofeminism, that basically females are more in touch with the environment and environmental preservation than men. Interesting belief. I think there's a lot of theory and statistics to back that up. Cultural landscapes. Landscapes mirror culture's needs, values, attitudes toward the earth. Human geographer can learn a lot about a group of people by observing and studying landscapes. So some of the earlier studies, like John Wesley Powell and so forth, really did these accounts of how environments, societies function with the land. Really interesting, and that's where the whole ideas of possibilism and environmental determinism came up. So essentially, did humans affect the environment, or did the environment affect humankind? So we definitely study that in human geography. Symbolic landscapes, settlement forms. So you have all kinds, relatively dense settlement form, dispersed, spatial arrangement around buildings, roads, and towns. So we can kind of see the dispersion models we looked at before is putting those in land division patterns. So how do we build land or subdivide it? Architectural styles, we saw that in terms of the example of the Catholic Church in Laos, or the Buddhist Church in Laos, the two churches earlier. Architecture is a reflection of culture. So this is kind of what we're going to get into. This is kind of a good overview chapter, but we will dig more into detail in several different areas going forward. Look forward to having you in class, and we will see you online soon.